Good afternoon, everyone. I suffer from the same problem Professor Frisch mentioned. It's rather hard to speak in the second to last panel. I can always fall on the academic truism that everything was said, but not everybody said it. Nevertheless, I'll try to thread maybe some of the points that were raised earlier. Let me thank, first of all, the Begin Sadat Center for inviting me to talk to you today, Professor Inbar, and particularly to my longtime friend and mentor, Dr. Eran Lerman, and to Bnei B'rith for supporting this conference. I'll take a leaf from the book of our French colleague and offer a short presentation with 6 points. 3 are general comments about the nature of conflict in the maritime environment, and try to divide the type of challenges or actors to 3 kinds. Great power actors that operate here, regional powers or actors, and non-state actors. Finally, and again, this corresponds with what Professor Frisch was saying. My focus as our work in Haifa is really on the maritime domain. So our point of departure is the body of water, if you will. Although we, of course, you cannot analyze it without the human activity, and we're, of course, looking, as in Professor Abulafzia's great book, we're also looking at the struggle for mastery over the seas, coasts, ports, and islands. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation. This is the nanotechnology building, but we have to sit in darkness to see the PowerPoint. I apologize. אתה יכול לסגור אותו? תודה רבה. Let me start with 3 general comments about conflict in our region. First of all, as you heard in the last 2 days, this is a moment of profound change and uncertainty in the region. We heard a lot about the operational side, if you will, Syria and Libya collapsing into horrific civil wars, the rise of ISIS, and so on. So that's obviously one dimension, but I want to submit to you that part of the uncertainty of this openness of uncertainty of what will happen next, what we call in the jargon of social science a punctuated equilibrium, I think is conceptual. So it's not simply the political realities, but also fundamental questions of what exactly is the nature of the threat we are facing. There's talk about threats in the maritime domain, and we hear positions like Professor Frisch's that maybe there is no threat. Israel's own leaders are not certain of who is the most major threat. Is it Hezbollah? Is it ISIS? Is it the Russian-Iranian axis that Mike Duran was talking about yesterday? I think it's even this basic notion of what is victory. So we heard reflections of our French colleague about Libya and Iraq. So you occupy and you depose the government. This was the traditional victory, but it turns out that's not enough. Can we have situations, are we moving away from the binary reality that Mike described yesterday of us and them, this triangle table of understanding realities, or are we moving to a reality in which you can cooperate with someone in one arena and fight with them in another arena? If indeed, as President Rivlin said, ISIS is the major problem, at least theoretically, Israel, Iran, and Hezbollah share the same interest. Maybe we are in a reality of what's called in the jargon of venture capital frenemies. You can be friends and enemies both at the same time. I think even the energy issue, which a lot of the conversation on the Eastern Med revolves around, even this, if we look in the internal Israeli discussion, the framing is unclear. Is it an issue of national security, as the Prime Minister had been arguing earlier this week in the Supreme Court, and as Amit Mor described earlier, or as the demonstrators in the street suggest, it's an issue of social justice. So even getting the framing, the story, if you will, of our wonderful discoveries out in the sea are not clear. So that's my first comment, this moment of openness. When we read the history books, we look at these transition moments, these interwar years. We are in one of these periods. Things are opening up. There's a debate if the borders will survive or not, what will emerge out of it. And I think this should equip all of us with a grain of salt in trying to predict or offer scenarios, as I was invited to do here. So that's my first point. The second point is the Eastern Med is becoming much more crowded in terms of the number of actors, arenas, players you have to think about. We have new actors, but some old actors didn't disappear. So Syria may have disintegrated to hundreds of armed groups, but the Syrian government is also one of these actors. We have non-state actors, ISIS. We have human traffickers and the European response, the European military effort or naval effort in the Mediterranean to stop this. Countries as far away as Finland. This picture on the bottom right, that's a Finnish boat that deployed in the Mediterranean a month ago. So many actors that were not active here.
To enjoy the sun.
Yes, that's probably true. Ephraim said they want to enjoy the sun. As part of the revamped effort of the Europeans to stop immigration. We have the Russians, we heard long presentations about that. We have private companies, major corporations, especially in oil and gas, that did not participate, at least in our immediate Israeli political system, are now players. So it's Nobel Energy or a Shell that bought British gas. We have the Chinese. This is a picture from a visit to the port of Haifa 2012 of a Chinese military vessel. I'll say a few words down the road about China around here. So this is much more crowded with many, many more variables to think about on conflicts in the maritime domain. And my third comment, and here this is borrowed from Admiral Gary Roughead, who was our guest at Haifa earlier in the month, former Chief of Naval Operations and former Commander of PACOM, Pacific Command. And his point, which I completely adopt, even when we think of the strategy of the Eastern Med, we have to widen the scope. We have to look down at the Red Sea, potentially the Gulf of Aden, partly because the big vectors of power through China will go through there. China, as I think Jonathan Reynolds mentioned, has its first base in the region. They signed a deal with Djibouti. That's here. To have a base for supply for ships. And this is also not new. If you look at the Italian-British fight over the Mediterranean in the Second World War, the Italians operated a flotilla of submarines in the Red Sea. Because for the Italians who were with Mussolini's preposterous dream of Mare Nostrum, even to gain command of Mare Nostrum, they had to deploy some force in the Red Sea. And of course, on the most operational level, because of the threat of pirates from Somalia, a lot of the international efforts, including forces that were usually deployed in the Mediterranean, are now deployed down near Somalia. So I think General Amidror mentioned that earlier in the morning. It's not so clear when we talk about the Eastern Med. What is the Eastern Med? If we take the maritime perspective, which I propose here, I think we have to open the scope and look also at the Red Sea. So these are my three broad comments about conflict scenarios. Let me now turn a bit to talk about great powers, regional powers, non-state actors. One great power that was absent from our discussion, but it's inevitable that we'll have to analyze it in greater depth, is China. In the year 2013, the Chinese offered the following vision. It's called the New Silk Road, or in other places it's called One Belt, One Road. The pink line is a line of trade that will go from central China all the way to Europe. The blue one is the maritime version of that. The idea is to create a path, a superhighway, if you will, of trade, political influence, train roads, even potentially same standards for electricity, investment. In reality, it means investments in port facilities, road facilities, train facilities, bases, as we saw in Djibouti. And you can see it goes up through the Red Sea, Suez Canal, Eastern Mediterranean, towards Italy. This has been in the working. So on top of the base in Djibouti, if you just look at our own neighborhood, the immediate ports of Eastern Mediterranean has dramatic Chinese influence. Piraeus, the biggest port, is half owned by Chinese companies, and we know that these companies are always mixed with states. Israel's two ports are built. One is now, they're both getting new sections to the ports. One is built by a Chinese company, Ashdod, and the northern one, Haifa, which is also the Navy's main base, is going to be operated by a Chinese company called China Harbor. So they're here. And Damietta, the Egyptian big port, some of the facilities of trading are now owned by Chinese companies, or at least they made bids for that. So any attempt to analyze long-term conflicts here in terms of power politics should take this into account. What are the implications of this? One of them is that we all have the Cold War framework of Russia and the US, the Sixth Fleet, the American Sixth Fleet, and the Soviet Fifth Squadron, which was reinstated this year. But here we have a mixture which goes, I think, even more back. Professor Abulafi has much better command of that, but it's a mixture, this mixture of economic interests, including deployment of civilian workers. The Chinese, there are two big maritime operations here. We're moving tens of thousands of Chinese workers and other citizens from Libya in 2011 and from Yemen in 2015. Because of the nature of Chinese corporate governance, it's a mixture of state operation and private. But this itself creates a whole new set of conflicts. We know in Asia that, for example, Chinese-Vietnamese tensions were translated to riots in Vietnam against Vietnamese of Chinese origin. So, and of course, it's inevitable that there'll be economic tensions over some of these deals. So that's a whole new set of conflicts that's not immediate, but if we think of China as the big rising power that's going to challenge the US on a global level, we are going to have, I think, some manifestation of this in our region. The second great power was analyzed in great depth. I'll just, the Russians, of course. All this, of course, occurs in the context of US moving away. I won't belabor the point. This was discussed a lot here. Russia, I think, the immediate effect on the maritime domain, the deployment of about 10 vessels who are using cruise missiles from the Mediterranean into targets in Syria, constrains the strong actors around, including us. If we could have operated freely, now there's someone you have to think about in the immediate environment. We have Russian involvement, if you think about it analytically, in all three levels. On the great power level, challenging the US or entering into the vacuum the US had left, versus other states. We saw the clash with Turkey and Israel's effort not to get into a similar situation. Finally, Russian involvement in the sub-state level, its immediate involvement in Syria. And the big question we're all left with, I think, in the Russians, is this going to be a new Afghanistan or a new Boyar moment of Ivan the Terrible, in which he consolidates power by assertiveness? And here I think it's still an open question. So this is the great powers, Russians, Chinese, Americans. The second powers we have to think about are the regional actors. At least on the security side, we of course know about the decline of the Syrian Navy, the civil war in Libya and in Syria. I want to point out to three main developments. We have massive procurement of two navies here. The Turkish Navy, Borak described that earlier, that's their symbol. They go back to 1081. That's a navy with tradition. In the middle, we have a model of the helicopter carrier that the Egyptians are buying from the French. These, ironically, were supposed to be sold for the Russians, and then the deal was canceled, and the boats are going to the Egyptians, going to be deployed by March. The Turks also have, as Borak described, an ability to project power through a landing platform / carrier. So we have two major powers with a long military tradition. The Turkish Navy is the biggest one around. And Borak, I think, described that very accurately. It's not clear against who they're going to project it, but we have a buildup here that can project power in the region and at least in the Turkish aspirations beyond. The third country that's building up its maritime capabilities is Israel. As you may know, Israel bought 6 submarines. The fifth one just arrived. That's a picture of Prime Minister Netanyahu surveying it. This introduces another dimension to the maritime domain, which we don't talk a lot about, into Israel's strategic deterrent capabilities. So it gives the Navy and the seas a new meaning from an Israeli security perspective. Another buildup is to defend the gas platforms. The Navy became responsible for that in 2013, and Israel is buying 4 corvettes to deal with that. All that means that in the Israeli strategic mind, and in terms of assets deployed, the Navy is becoming more and more important. So that's for the regional actors and how they might get involved in conflicts. Finally, let me say a few words about non-state actors. So we have as mentioned here a number of times, in these spaces of limited governance, like Sinai, Lebanon, Libya, we have armed groups, many of them are Islamists, who are presenting a threat of sorts. I'll point maybe to 2 or 3 of them. So the gentleman here on the right-hand side, he's the Vice Admiral Johnston, commands the maritime forces of NATO. In a press conference a few weeks ago, he warned that ISIS's control in the port of Sirte will allow it some ability to attack targets that are going in the sea nearby. The main dilemma for these non-state actors, as Professor Frisch mentioned, because of the cost of platforms, those who cannot deploy platforms are looking for other means. The most dominant strategy is what the Chinese are calling, or we all call it, anti-access area denial. That's a missile capability that can prevent navies from coming close to the coast. And one big question we ask as we think about conflicts, will these non-state actors compensate for their inability to deploy big platforms by developing this capability? In 2006, and that's the picture in the middle, Hezbollah Chinese missile, that's not a coincidence, C-802 hit an Israeli ship, killing 4 sailors. And the question is, will all these organizations develop such a capability? One of Israel's red lines in Lebanon essentially is not transferring these types of missiles from Syria, Iran, China to Hezbollah, but it's definitely something that has to be taken into account. And finally, the picture here on the left is another solution of non-state actors, small groups of combatants. This is the Hamas's Navy SEAL of sorts, which in what they're doing, it turns out they're quite good. They have to swim not so long distance and then attack targets on the Israeli side. In an act that our chief of staff described as brave, they managed in the last conflict in Gaza to go on the beach and stick a bomb on an Israeli tank. It did not explode. They were all killed, as Hillel mentioned. But nevertheless, it's another, if you think about it analytically, it's another solution of these non-state actors to deal with the countries that dominate the seas. And there's an interesting analogy here, if you will, to the situation in the South China Sea. Once China is inferior in terms of its platforms, it has to push the Americans away. So it's done through the claims on the 9-dash line, but also developing this massive missile capability. Professor Abulafia challenged us yesterday to think about these questions in a historical context. I think he said historical thinking for contemporary questions. This area of non-governable areas and actors that threaten the maritime routes is a old problem in the Mediterranean. If you look at the in Professor Abulafia's book, there's a description, I think, of 10 to 12 different pirate groups that operated here over the years. As we all know, the American involvement, maritime involvement in the region began in the 2 Barbary Wars, where an area controlled by pirates in Tripoli, what we call now Libya, threatened American boats. The Americans did not want to pay ransom, hence the marine involvement and why the shores of Tripoli entered the marine anthem. But what's a bit less known is that the American maritime deployment lasted for most of the century. So if we want one lesson from these non-state actors, be they ISIS or human traffickers, is that the institutions that are set to deal with them have what we call in the jargon of social science, the stickiness of institutions. They may survive even when the threat disappears. Case in point, Frontex, the European agency that deals with borders, is now being bolstered, probably going to be replaced altogether. Once this institution is going to be created, there's going to be a larger maritime presence that will probably last beyond the current crisis. This is a picture of Birch, the capture of the Tripoli. This is the Barbary ship that was caught by the USS Enterprise, the 3rd Enterprise. So if I have to conclude my comments looking back from our Israeli perspective, Israel looks now west towards the sea. The sea holds a great promise. The gas, our strategic deterrent, the relationship that were described here with Greece and Cyprus, but also, let me add, great vulnerabilities. So we see the gas platform. Amit told us in the morning, 50% of our electricity is in the single cable, on the single platform, which is in the sea and not that far from Gaza. About 50% of our water now comes from desalination plants. That's the biggest one in Israel, and I think of its kind in the world. That's near Hadera. Any problem like a gas spill, attack on these stations will have massive ramifications for our infrastructure. We are involved in a Navy blockade on Gaza. That's the Mavi Marmara that helped sink even further our relationship with Turkey. And so as we look west, I think we should look at the great hope and promise that we describe here, but also think of these new vulnerabilities. And again, I'm harping back, as Professor Abulafia recommended, and it turns out that Israel, there's a cyclical way in which Israel looks at the sea. From the 30s to the 50s, the sea was a central component in the thinking of our leadership, in particular David Ben-Gurion. In fact, one of the secular holidays of the Yeshuv and later the young state was Yom Hayam, the Day of the Sea, which was celebrated nationwide with parades. That's the one from 1944, in which David Ben-Gurion himself gave the prime speech. But as Israel moved away from the sea, Yom Hayam was cancelled, I think, in 1953. We are now back again to a reality in which we have to think about the seas more seriously, and I think, unlike the 50s, we are going to look west for a long time. Thank you very much.